Hey guys, FilthyRobot here, bringing you another guides, tips, and tricks video, this time talking about playing Liberty. This is meant as a companion video to my Tradition versus Liberty guide. The Tradition versus Liberty guide was designed to tell you the differences between the two, how to choose between them, and what to expect when you chose one versus the other. This guide is designed to talk to you about playing Liberty as that decision. You made the decision to play Liberty, how do you play it well, what do you do to maximize your Liberty game? As a quick disclaimer, I make guide videos for the multiplayer Civ, so if you are playing single player Civ, some of this may not be quite as useful to you. A lot of the strategies translate from multiplayer to single player, but not all of them. Additionally, I play in the No Quitters Steam group, which means I tend to play with a pretty standard set of rules. We play with strategic balance, almost always on 6-player maps, and almost always on Pangea. What this means is that some of the strategies here are going to be a little different than if you're playing on different settings, so just be aware of that. I have had a lot of feedback since the Tradition versus Liberty video, asking specific questions about Liberty. This is part of the reason why I want to do this. And I also see a lot of players playing Liberty in ways that I really don't agree with. I see what I think they are basically misusing the Liberty tree and getting pretty poor results from that. Oftentimes I see one of two real things, right, from Liberty players. I will see them do a strategy where they go to early war, often attacking their neighbors. Sometimes they win straight up, sometimes it's more of a drawn-out war, and sometimes it's a straight-up stalemate. But either way, I almost always see these players become irrelevant by late medieval, Renaissance, industrial, maybe early modern. I see them irrelevant. Their science is so far behind everyone else's science that they're no longer impactful to the game, and they often either ask to be voted irrelevant or send there just hitting end turn until someone comes and kills them. The other thing I see Liberty players do is I see them playing basically bad Tradition as Liberty, where they do a Liberty build and end up on 6 or 7 cities, and then find that they cannot compete with the 4 to 6 cities that Tradition players are going to be founding with the 6 or 7 cities they have as Liberty, and the same type of deal. They're going to go irrelevant perhaps a little bit later in the game, but they're basically doing the Tradition game with the Liberty social policies and finding that the Liberty social policies don't work as well as the Tradition social policies when you're doing the Tradition style game. And I want to really kind of dedicate this guide to hopefully putting a stop to those two styles of play, because I think they're probably fairly frustrating for players who are both using them, and also they're very frustrating for the other players in the game who go, I wish this player was relevant to the outcome of this game and it wasn't just irrelevant and then out of this game. Alright, so I'm going to quickly talk about just a few civs. There's probably a list of about 15 civs here that I think are very strong Liberty civs. All civs in the game are potentially possible to go Liberty with, perhaps except Venice, and of course to some degree India is also very, very difficult to do Liberty with. But in general, almost all the civs are capable of doing Liberty, but there are some that are better at it, and they're better at it because they address the disadvantages of Liberty. Liberty has gold disadvantages, culture disadvantages, and science disadvantages. And these disadvantages can often be met by religion or unique buildings. So we're going to talk just about a couple civs real quickly here that are very strong Liberty civs because of the bonuses they have. First of these is Songhai. The Mud Pyramid Mosque is really what is making that. There's a little bit of extra gold in the early game from triple gold from Barbarians, but really it's the free. This is a temple replacement that's free. It gives you culture and faith and has no gold cost associated with it, which is really big for Liberty. The Huns are quite a decent Liberty civ. They have a very dominant early game military unit, which makes taking cities quite cheap. They can raise cities they don't want quickly, and they get a bonus production from pastures, which means that they have a flat bonus. Any of the flat bonuses to production are quite good for Liberty. I don't like Rome as a Liberty civ. I don't actually find this 25% production towards buildings that already exist in the capital all that helpful. It's a percent modifier for cities that are going to be making very, very low hammers. It's probably going to be a very small amount of actual hammers in it. Yeah, it's okay as a Liberty civ, but I don't think it's all that great a bonus. The Celts are a phenomenal Liberty civ. They have a early game faith bonus that often translates into, first of all, that is a flat bonus per city, so more cities means more of this bonus, and it almost always translates into a very, very early pantheon, and thus, and probably because of that, a very early religion from the Celts, which is extremely powerful for Liberty games. Additionally, they have an early game unit and a local happiness building, although this is a difficult local happiness building for Liberty players to get to because it's so deep in the hammer cost, right? You have to have an amphitheater, and then before you can build the opera house, and that's quite a lot of hammers to spend on a pretty tangential building, but it does have 3 local happiness, which can be spammed across your empire. Poland, of course, is a great liberty civ. It's a great anything civ because they have 1,000,000 free social policies. They also have a building that is it's a stable replacement that doesn't have a gold upkeep that also provides +1 gold per pasture, which is incredible, as well as a unique military unit that is fairly strong. And as Liberty, you're much more likely to go the artillery route than you are as Tradition. And if you do go the artillery route, you're going to be coming across the ability to build winged hussars, and they're actually one of the few decent lancer units in the game. Probably the only decent lancer unit in the game. So quite powerful bonuses for Liberty. Russia is a fairly good Liberty civ. Again, you're often going to be going the artillery route as Liberty. Cossacks are a cavalry replacement and a very, very strong replacement for that. They also have +1 production per strategic resource, and again, flat production bonuses are quite good for Liberty. Persia is a monster Liberty civ for a number of reasons. They have an early game unit that's quite strong. It's quite useful for doing things like gold or taking positions or attacking players or whatever you want. They have a bank replacement. You're going to be wanting to build banks as Liberty. It's a bank replacement that is more gold and also provides happiness. This is phenomenal for Liberty. And finally, their straight up, their Golden Age bonus is also incredible. Longer Golden Ages. Golden Ages are production, culture, and for Persia, military movement and military combat strength. This is a godlike Liberty civ. I don't actually think Carthage is very good as a Liberty civ. Yes, coastal connections are free, but when you're playing Liberty in the way that I think Liberty ought to be played, you're expanding so many times that probably only a small percentage of your empire is going to be coastal. So this again becomes very, very situational. So yes, a couple of your cities have free city connections. Maybe you probably are going to need roads anyways, and the rest of the bonuses really don't make much of a difference. I don't think much of Carthage as a civ, and I don't think they're all that good as a Liberty civ. England, very, very strong Liberty civ because they have a dominant medieval military unit and a dominant Renaissance military unit, as well as an extra spy. The extra spy is going to allow them to be a little bit more relevant in terms of spy steals, and these 2 units mean that you can potentially end the game much earlier than you could otherwise. Mongolia is an okay Liberty civ. The problem is Keshiks really don't end the game. You can get a lot of killing done with Keshiks, but you probably can't kill the world with them, as eventually people will tech past that. But they are quite good at killing a lot of different people, so not too bad. It's another early game unit that's quite good. Ethiopia, probably one of the top 3 or top 4 Liberty civs out there because of the Stele. This is a monument replacement that provides culture and faith instead of just culture, and it's spammable. You can have 1 per city, which means the more cities you have, the more steles you can build, the more faith you can get, and it's quite an early building that you're going to be wanting to build anyways. This means they're very likely to get 1st or possibly 2nd religion, which means you get to redress all the weaknesses of Liberty with religion if you can. Very, very strong Liberty civ. Arabia is quite a good Liberty civ. They're a good Liberty civ because camel archers. Camel archers basically are not irrelevant until infantry, and you can kill the world with camel archers, and that's kind of what you want to do. That's one of the victory paths that Liberty has, which is basically ending the game before the later eras where it's weaker. Additionally, the Bazaar is quite a decent market replacement. It potentially adds extra gold from a couple resources you might not get otherwise, allows you to trade more efficiently if people are still trading with you, and of course you're going to be wanting to build markets in all of your cities as Liberty. The Iroquois are actually a fairly okay Liberty civ, despite being a garbage civ overall, and they're fairly okay for a couple reasons. The Longhouse is a cheaper workshop that doesn't provide the percentage production bonus that the regular Longhouse does, but in exchange you get +1 production off worked forest tiles. Well, Liberty games, your cities tend to be small. The percentage bonus may not actually be as valuable in these cities. It's easier to find a trade where there's a couple forest tiles you can work that will then be more beneficial than the percentage bonus would have been. In the tradition cities, your city tends to be large enough with a high enough production that the percentage bonus tends to be better. So what this means in smaller cities, the Longhouse is actually a little bit better than it might be otherwise. Additionally, the city connections are a little bit more useful for Liberty. In part because in tradition your roads need to be double duty. They're both city connections and military defensive roads, and they need to be efficient. And the Iroquois paths, they don't always allow you to efficiently defend because they slow you down when you cross rivers or transition from road to forest, basically, is the issue. And that may not be quite as relevant to Liberty, so the free gold from that is actually very valuable. They're okay as a Liberty civ is what it boils down to, and a unique military unit, I guess. The Mohawk Warrior is fairly junk, so it doesn't really matter too much for that. Spain is a monster Liberty civ. Spain is already a snowball civ. If you find wonders in the early game and can settle wonders, you are in an extremely powerful position early. Liberty allows you to, Liberty is an early game strategy, basically. It has the most benefits that affect it in the early game. So if you have 2 early game bonuses, the Spain bonus plus the Liberty bonus, you can snowball very, very quickly. My Spain games, the last 2 Spain games I've had, which should be up on YouTube relatively shortly after this airs, were conceits. People are conceding to me inside the first 60, 70 turns of the game because of how quickly Spain snowballs. And you can do that even better as Liberty. Additionally, if Spain gets to settle a natural wonder, it will generate a ton of faith per turn, and faith is extremely important to Liberty Empire. So Spain is a pretty dominant Liberty civ. Let's see, who else in here? None of these are particularly good. Oh, here we go. Mayans, probably top 2 or 3 Liberty civs out there as well. Mostly because of the pyramid, but also their unique bonus is good as well. Pyramid is a shrine replacement that provides 2 faith instead of 1 and provides 2 science per city that can build this. It's spammable. You can have 1 per city, which means the more of these you get, the more of the bonus you get from this. It's a very early game building, and it's a very, very powerful bonus. 2 science and 2 faith is quite good. It means it's going to catapult you towards your religion very quickly and make up for any science losses you're going to be getting from having smaller cities, at least in the early game. Very, very powerful. Additionally, theology is quite good for Liberty players. What theology does is it gives you a great person every so many turns. The great person does affect the timers on other great people. So if you get a great scientist from the Mayan long count, it is going to bring the base cost of your scientists from 67 to 134 or whatever the next push of that timer would have been, which means it sets back the great people that you generate from great people points. But the thing about Liberty games are you very rarely have the ability to work great person points because your cities don't tend to be big enough to work specialists for a very long time, which means that the downside of the long count bonus, which is it pushes back the people you're hard generating, tends not to be as relevant because you might not be getting those people for ages and ages anyways because you can't work the great people. So it comes at less of a cost than it may in the tradition cities. Additionally, the same is true for the Liberty Finisher. When you take the Liberty Finisher, you get to choose a free great person, and it pushes back the great person counts on all your great people to do that. So this kind of stacks with that. Yes, it pushes it way, way back, but you get them early, and you're probably not getting the later ones anyways. The Incan are quite a good Liberty civ. They're a good Liberty civ for 2 reasons. They have a very dominant military bonus, which is the no terrain cost penalties when moving into hills. And additionally, they have the half-off roads everywhere and full free roads and hills, which means that you're not paying a lot of the upkeep costs associated with roads, which is really good for Liberty because Liberty is gold starved. And of course, the Terrace Farm is quite good for everybody. Shoshone are a very good Liberty civ. They're very good Liberty civ because Liberty borders do not expand properly. They're very, very, very slow on their border expansion, which means you often cannot get the tiles you want to work. And since you are always gold shy in Liberty games, you often can't buy the tiles you want. Liberty gets to just, Shoshone just gets to settle and get all the tiles in their borders pretty much instantly, which is amazing. Additionally, they get bonuses to fighting in their own territory, which is good. They have the Pathfinder, which is an early game unit that lets you select the bonuses you get from Ancient Runes, which is basically an early game snowball strategy, which is really good for Liberty because it complements their early game bonuses. And then they also have a cavalry replacement, and again, Liberty often goes down the artillery route to try to end games early, and having a cavalry replacement that's better is quite good for that. Egypt is probably the best Liberty civ out there, or if not the best, at least top 3, and it's all due to the Burial Tomb. The Burial Tomb is a unique temple replacement that has no gold upkeep and provides 2 local happiness. This allows you to spam cities non-stop and get religion going in your cities without the detrimental side of temples, which is their insane upkeep cost. Additionally, they have an early game military unit, which is decent. It doesn't require horses. You can spam them and it's a little bit faster, and it's basically a chariot archer. And they also have 20% production towards wonder construction, which is surprisingly relevant in the early game Liberty, even if it's not so relevant in the late game Liberty games. Moving on. Byzantium are a decent Liberty Civ. The problem is that whether or not they get a religion is very much chance oriented, because they get bonuses once they've found a religion, but they don't get bonuses to actually getting that religion. However, they do have two very strong early game units. The Droman and the Cataphract are both phenomenal. And if you do get a religion as Byzantium, especially if you get first or second religion, you can make very dominant powerhouse religions that will help make up for the downsides of Liberty play. And then finally, China is a quite good Liberty Civ, and they're a quite good Liberty Civ mostly due to the Paper Maker, but also due to their other bonuses. The Paper Maker is a library replacement. Libraries have an upkeep of 1. The Paper Maker has 0 upkeep and also gives you 2 gold. So this is essentially 3 gold per city. It's better than building a market. And since Liberty suffers from gold issues and has a hard time affording libraries early, this kills 2 birds with 1 stone. It helps with the gold income, and then it also allows them to get libraries up very, very early in their cities, which makes them very, very powerful. Additionally, they have a quite strong medieval unit, which means that when they go to war, if they go to war, they have very big advantages for that. Right in the peak of the Liberty Hammer bonus, right in medieval, when they are at their highest relative hammers compared to tradition, they're going to have also a unique military unit that makes them even stronger. And then they have 2 bonuses in their unique ability towards war. Better bonuses near Great Generals and faster Great Generals, so very strong Liberty Civ as well. All right, let's talk a little bit about Liberty. Liberty is going to have a hammer bonus. That's what Liberty does. They get better hammers, and they get better hammers. Maybe we should start the game for this. Let's start the game for this, and we'll get yelled at for like 30 seconds here, but then we'll talk more.
Blessings of heaven be upon you, Empress Wu Zutian, most beautiful and...
All right. What a weird start. So, why do we want to take Liberty? What does Liberty do for us? Like, why wouldn't we just go tradition? We know tradition's good. We know that tradition has the best late game out there of the starting social policies. We know that honor and piety really aren't starting policies that you can open with, because they don't provide enough of the essential growth, happiness, culture, etc. that you need in the early game to be successful. So really, you're choosing between tradition and Liberty. And tradition, we know, is really strong late game. So why don't we always just pick tradition? Well, the short answer is Liberty has a very, very powerful early game, and they have a powerful early game for 2 real reasons, and this is potentially Republic and Collective Rule. Republic is +1 hammer in every city and +5% production in cities when building buildings. That 5% doesn't really matter that much. It's a little bit, it might help a little bit, but really it's the +1 hammer early, and additionally the free settler that comes out at Collective Rule, and not only the free settler, but when your capital builds settlers after this policy has been assigned, the settlers are, it phrases it as though they're half off. What it really does is it doubles your production towards settlers, which is really, really valuable. Which means that you spend a lot less of your early game building settlers than tradition players, even though you're building more settlers, and we'll talk about why in just a minute. Additionally, it gets citizenship. Citizenship is a free worker plus a permanent bonus towards building improvements. It gets the pyramids, which is the wonder that's unlocked by Liberty, and that also is 2 more workers and again a stacking production bonus towards improvements. Then it gets meritocracy, which is +1 happiness for every city connection, it's +1 happiness for every city you have connected to the capital, including the capital itself. So it's an instant 1 happiness even with no city connections, and then +1 happiness for every city connection. And this is global happiness, not local happiness, and we'll talk about the difference about that in just a minute. And it also is -5% unhappiness from citizens in non-occupied cities, which means that 1 in every 20 citizens is free towards your happiness. And then finally it gets representation, which starts the Golden Age, finishes your Liberty policy. You want to get this last, by the way. The build order for Liberty should always be Republic, Collective Rule, Citizenship, meritocracy, representation. Representation makes your culture policies for future policies go down, but it's retroactive, so it's not like if you get it later, it's going to help you more in terms of the future social costs. It's not. It just means you have lost a little bit more culture getting the previous ones. And also starts a Golden Age. When you finish Liberty, you get to choose a great person of your choice. It's not really free. It's free in the sense that you didn't have to generate it, but it pushes back the timers for future great people of that type. And the engineer, merchant, and scientist always share great people point. But for whatever reason, if you pick a prophet from Liberty, it also pushes back the science, engineer, and merchant timer of your guys from the Liberty finisher, which is kind of dumb, but just how it works. All right. Let's talk a little bit about settling Liberty cities and what you kind of want to do with Liberty cities. So, but before we do that, we need to talk about local and global happiness. So, all right. When you found, all right, so on Immortal, your difficulty level determines your base happiness. You just start with the base amount of happiness. And on Immortal, you start with, I think it's Prince all the way up to Deity, you start with 9 happiness from difficulty level. When I found this city, and we could talk about city placement, but for now, let's just not worry about it, right? When I found the city, I lost 4 happiness. Why did I lose 4 happiness? Every city you found is 3 global unhappiness. So that means that every city, regardless of the population in that city, causes 3 global unhappiness, and each population point in that city causes 1 local unhappiness. So we have 9 total happiness. We just lost 3 from the city and 1 from the population, and that's displayed on our little counter here. You can get global unhappiness back, or rather, you can counter global unhappiness with global happiness. There's only a couple ways to get global happiness. You can get global happiness from finding wonders. Every wonder you find is +1 global happiness. You can get global happiness from from luxury resources. Every unique luxury resource you have in your empire, either that you have improved yourself or are trading for, is +4 global happiness. You can get global happiness from social policies. So every social policy, for example, this social policy that gives you 1 happiness for every city you have that's connected to the capital and 1 happiness for your capital, that's global happiness. And then you can get global happiness from wonders. So wonders such as Chichen Itza, Notre Dame, or later on things like where is it? Eiffel Tower or whatnot. Those give you global happiness. And you can get global happiness from some social policies. But that's basically it. And what this means is most of the time the bulk of your unhappiness is going to be caused by population. But so population causes what's called local unhappiness. For every population point you get +1 local unhappiness. And local unhappiness can be countered either by excess global happiness, or it can be countered by local happiness. And local happiness is generated from things like pretty much all the happiness buildings, the ones that you can build all along, like coliseums, zoos, pagodas, that kind of stuff, right? They provide the plus happiness that you can build in the city. Those only provide local happiness. What this means is if, let's say this city was 3 pop, right? So it's a 3 pop city, and it's a city itself. And the 3 pop city is going to be 3 unhappiness for the city itself, and 3 unhappiness, 1 for each population, right? If you have a pagoda which provides 2 happiness, and a coliseum which provides 2 happiness, it only is going to counter 3 of the unhappiness in that city, not 4, because they can only counter local unhappiness, and local unhappiness is caused by population. So they can only counter population unhappiness. And what this means is you're actually limited on the number of cities you can found based on global happiness, because you can't found an infinite number of cities because each city provides 3 global unhappiness, and you can only counter global unhappiness in a limited amount from the policies, etc., that we've talked about. What this means is basically, if you had no local unhappiness, so if you could counter every point of local unhappiness with a happiness building, you could have, as Liberty, you could have 2 cities per luxury. So, and there'll be some left over from the difficulty and some left over from your world wonders, but basically you could have 2 happiness per luxury, and that's because the city costs you 3, but it's 3 minus 1 because of meritocracy. So really the city is basically costing you 2 local unhappiness per city you plant. Why do we care about any of this? I mean, this is kind of a complicated, convoluted explanation for a mechanic that is a pretty bizarre mechanic in the first place. Well, what we care about is it determines the maximum number of cities you can realistically plant when you're playing Liberty. So you go to yourself, if I had all this land, or I have this set amount of land available to me, how many cities do I want to plant? Well, you have some limitations in place by the number of luxuries. So when you're scouting lands as Liberties, it's important to pay attention to how many luxuries you have. As a general rule of thumb, you could, in a perfect world, you could probably have 2 cities per lux. Realistically, you're more likely to get about 1.5, give or take. So around that rule of thumb. With tradition, you're looking basically over a 1-to-1 ratio, and that's because you're never going to have enough local happiness to counter your local unhappiness because your population is going to be too big. But anyways, let's talk a little bit about the Liberty build order. As tradition, you're probably going to end up with something like Scout Scout Shrine or Scout Scout Worker. As Liberty, you really need to get the monument out faster. You can't wait. You don't have the free social policy. You don't have legalism. Legalism gives free monuments to tradition players. As Liberty, it's extremely important to get your culture rolling early. Because what you want to do is you want to get to collective rule. Collective rule is basically the linchpin of of Liberty games. This is going to be the only real benefit that Liberty gets early, and it's going to be the one that snowballs into all the rest of their benefits. And that's because what it allows you to do is it gets you a free settler, and that's important, because the tradition player basically goes his scout, shrine, worker, whatever it happens to be, maybe fits in one wonder at the cost of a settler, but he basically has to hard build 2 to 3 settlers at somewhere around 8 to 12 turns of production per settler that he wants to do, and he often has to do this at pop 3, or maybe if he's lucky pop 4, because he's competing for spots that are going to go quickly if he doesn't get settlers out, right? The Liberty player has a little bit of a different game. You basically do not want to produce settlers as Liberty before collective rule unless you are racing for a spot, probably because of a natural wonder, but possibly because it's a strategic location. You don't want to do that before collective rule, because collective rule is where all your bonus comes from. And this basically means in your capital, only in your capital, by the way, your settlers are, they build at each hammer counts twice for settlers. It calls it 50% off, but it's not quite like that. I mean, for all intents and purposes, it works that way. But what it really does is it multiplies your hammers by 2. All right, we're going to do just a little bit of this. Let's go Scout Monument. This is the build you probably want to do as Liberty, because you need to get that culture flowing sooner so you can get collective rule sooner. Because if without, I mean, the Liberty city, basically when you open this city, your city has one culture. That's from your palace. And then when you open Liberty, you're going to get 1 culture per city. But that's only 2 culture. And then the monument brings it up to 4. So as soon as you get the monument out, you're making twice as much culture as you would be otherwise in that city, which means it's going to be twice as fast to get to collective rule. Anyways, let's start scouting around here. Probably in an ideal world we have scouted before we settled. This is an okay settlement spot. I didn't really think about it in relationship to the rest of it. I probably wouldn't go Liberty in this game, but we've already decided we're going Liberty, so let's go Liberty. You have options what you can tech first. You don't always have to tech pottery first, because you may not want a shrine first, because the way it works out timing wise is you're going to be a little late to your shrine if you go Scout Monument, because it takes too much production. The production on a second scout is cheaper than it is to build a monument. Alright, let's try to get a little bit of a sense around here, and once we've done that, we'll talk about where we'd settle. I guess I don't really need to pledge in just a walkthrough, do I? All I want to do early is get some sense of my lands and borders, so that I can make decisions about where we're going to be settling. It's a city-state in there. And we're counting luxuries, right? So we have 2 in the capital. We have another one over here, the incense. We have another one over here. We have the gems. Kabul is going to have a luxury. They have gold. And there's going to be a luxury on this city-state. It looks like probably gold as well. Alright, finish that monument. Alright, so here's where the interesting part of Liberty comes out, right? So, as tradition, pretty much once you get that Scout shrine out, you're going to be wanting to spam settlers, because you're going to want to be taking your city positions. Maybe you want to fit in a wonder, that's going to cost you settlement positions unless you're very isolated. Maybe you want to fit in a worker, again it's going to slow those settlers down. But what you can do as Liberty, because you're really waiting on this social policy before you want to do anything, you have a bit of time in between the start of Liberty and when you finish collective rule before you really want to be spamming settlers. And what you can do at this time is you can try to get to pop 4 or pop 5. Remember, every hammer that you put into a settler counts double once you have that collective rule out. So really, if you can get to pop 5, so let's say a tradition player is working, let's say he has a pretty good start, he's on a hill, that's 2 hammers, and he gets to 3 pop, and he has 3 hills around him. That's basically the best case scenario. That's the most number of hammers he's ever going to have when building a settlers. It's going to be 2, 4, 6, 8 hammers for building that settler, right? That's about as good as he can get. Maybe he gets to pop 4 from a pop rune, but it's very unlikely he has a 4th hill in there to work, or I guess that'd be a 5th hill, because it's, but even then that's 10 hammers. With Liberty, if you can do something like 5 If you can do something like pop 5 before you produce any settlers, and you might be able to get to pop 5 before you get to collective rule, or you might be really close to pop 5 when you hit collective rule, and then you can wait a couple turns in between when you get your free settler and when you start building your settlers. You may have something like, let's say you have the same great lands the tradition player has. The tradition player is on 3 pop, and he has the city placement plus the 3 other hills. That's 4 hills. That's 8 production. Let's say you have 5 pop plus the city. And let's say you have the same number of hills, right? You have all hills as well. You're looking at 2, 4, 6, 8. Oh, let's just do 6 twos, which is 12, and then double it again. You're looking at 24 production compared to his 10 production because of the social policy here, doubling that. And what that means is that your settlers are a hell of a lot more efficient because you can afford to grow before spamming them out, because you're going to get them out faster once you do get them out and you get the free one. And once you are producing the settlers, you produce them much more efficiently than the tradition player does. And what this means is that frees up early game hammers to do other things that the tradition player really can't afford to do if he still wants to get his cities out. Yes, in the long run as a Liberty player, you're probably going to be building more settlers, and that's a little bit painful, but you can do something called backfilling, right? Which is you expand out to the borders that you want to set. You take those cities and plant them first, and then later on plant cities in between your farthest city out and your capital. And then you just kind of fill in the land before that. So you define your borders first and then fill in the land with the settlers. So that in the early game you have production that tradition players don't. And you can use this production, you should be using this production for a couple of things. You can be using this for a granary to help your city grow to try to get to pop 5 so you can spam settlers more efficiently. You can use this for a worker to begin improvements. You can use this for some military units to do things like tributing, or you can use this for some wonders that tradition players really aren't going to be able to afford as early as you're doing that. If you do go the wonder route, it's worth noting that religion is very, very dominant for Liberty players. If you can get a religion quickly, or first religion as a Liberty with a lot of faith production, you're going to be able to address a lot of the problems with the Liberty game that you might not be able to otherwise. So one of the things you can do is you can build Stonehenge, and that's a very, very valuable wonder for anyone, but the tradition player is likely not going to be able to start it as early as the Liberty player because they're sacrificing too much to do it. Now that's not always going to be the case. Sometimes tradition players have amazing land, just like Liberty players could. Sometimes tradition players are so isolated they don't have to compete for settlement spots, and sometimes tradition players are just totally wonder hungry and either are doing that just because they're bad at the game or doing this for whatever reason it happens to be. They might rush it anyways. You're not guaranteed to get it just because you're Liberty, but you have a better percentage chance of getting it as Liberty than you would as tradition, because as tradition you ought to be doing other things for a better game. So that's a very powerful wonder you can pick up early. You can also do something like Great Library, which is surprisingly decent. I don't really like Great Library rushing in general. It's risky. It sets all your stuff back. But as Liberty, you may want the science that might allow you to help bolster your science game for a long period of time. It's really going to help, probably up through the medieval era, put you in a science lead in all likelihood. Also, other wonders like gold wonders are quite valuable. Temple of Artemis, of course, is an amazing wonder for everybody, but I don't actually prioritize it very highly when it comes to things I have to do in my very early game. But also gold wonders such as Mausoleum or Pyramids. I don't actually recommend rushing the Pyramids particularly early. Yes, it is a high value wonder, and it's quite competitive when there's a number of Liberty players in the game, but in general you don't want to be paying upkeep on 2 more workers super early. You just don't need to be doing that. There's other wonders you could be rushing if you choose to go that wonder route. But what you need to do as a Liberty player in the early games, you need to be taking advantage of the fact that you get to grow a little bit more before you need to start spamming settlers, and once you do start spamming settlers, you're going to be more efficient at that. So you want to take those hammers and place them somewhere that's going to complement your game. Again, it could be wonders, it could be tributing, it could be infrastructure like workers and granaries. It doesn't matter, but you need to do something with that, because that's where you're. This is the start of the Liberty advantages in the very, very early game. It makes for faster starts that allow you to do more things than a tradition player is going to be able to do just based on the hammers that you have available. All right. Let's talk a little bit about settling. When you settle with Liberty, your borders are crap at expansion. Tradition has a policy. The opening policy for Tradition makes their borders expand faster. What this means is that when you settle Tradition cities, you often will think, oh, 3 tiles out. Look at all the luxuries and things I can get inside 3 tiles of my capital, or 3 tiles of the cities I expand. When you expand with Liberty cities, you don't get that option. Liberty cities do not grow very quickly. The way the governor grows, the AI manages the tiles that it grows to, is it grows to things based on their culture cost. And the culture cost goes up if it's rough terrain. It goes up if it's across like rivers or something like that. It's cheaper for flatland. I talked about the rough terrain part, but it's cheaper for flatland, and it seems to prioritize strategic resources and luxury resources above other things, and it seems to prioritize food above hammers. So what this means is something like a hill, especially like a desert hill. Oh right, terrain matters too. Desert is more expensive for whatever fucking reason than regular hills or that kind of stuff. But What it means is that this tile right here with 2 hammers, 0 food, no strategic resources, no luxury resources on it is super, super, super low priority for the governor. Which means governor, it may eventually grow to this one, but it's going to be after it grows to other. Oh, the ring, the distance out matters too. So the 3rd tile is more expensive than the 2nd tile away from the city. So this tile, it's two tiles out, it has no food, it has no strategic resource, has no luxury resource. It's going to be pretty low priority. Imagine if there's a hill here, it'd be even lower priority, right? Because it's even further out, so it now has the cultural cost of being further out too. It means the city's going to grow to things like this flatland grassland tile, this flat 1 food ocean tile. It's going to do that before it grows to this hill in all likelihood. And it might even do things like grow to like the 3rd ring before that 2nd ring. Or if there's the hill out here, it would definitely grow to the 3rd ring of friggin' ocean tiles, which are totally useless. In other words, what it means is the priorities of the governor don't actually prioritize tiles based on the utility that they actually have for players. And as a tradition player, you might go, okay, well, I'll just buy a couple tiles. And I only have 4 cities, so maybe I have to buy a couple tiles in a couple cities, and it's okay. And I have better culture growth anyway, so my borders expand quicker, so it's less. I have to pay less for that. As a Liberty player, you don't have that luxury. You're not going to have the gold. Your gold upkeep is going to be hammered. So the reason why Liberty has such shit gold is because Liberty has to build the same buildings that Tradition has to build, but it has to build more of them because it has more cities. And each building comes with a maintenance cost associated with it. And because Liberty has to do like 5, let's say they have 8 cities and Tradition has 4, that means they have double the maintenance costs on buildings that Tradition players are likely to have. What this means is you don't tend to have gold as a Liberty player because your gold is spent very heavily on building maintenance. And this means you're just not going to have the gold to purchase tiles. So what you need to be doing as a Liberty player is planting cities that are adjacent to tiles that the governor's not going to grow to that you want. And that tends to be basically adjacent to production tiles. So for example, settling on this incense is actually a fairly decent settle, kind of, for Liberty. But let's ignore the fact there's 0 food in the city whatsoever. You can plant, you could put some grassland farms on this or something, or build a granary and be okay. But basically, you want these hills. You could even plant on the sheep, for example. Well, maybe even like right there, except that's too close to Kabul. But basically, you want those hills in the inner border because the border that your city gets within the second it expands, the second it actually is settled, because it's not going to grow to those hills otherwise. And Liberty is about maximizing hammers in the early game, right? You're growing up to a point. With Tradition cities, you want them to grow all the time. With Liberty cities, you pretty much want them to grow to certain population points based on the tiles that you have available to work. So for a city like that just had these 2 hills and the oasis in it, so if I settled on that instance and it was just flatland, it's not the mod, I can't just put one down, but if I settled a city here and it would just be, it would have the borders all around it like that, I pretty much want to work the oasis, the sheep, and the hill. And that's all I really want it to work right then. So there's not much point in it growing more than pop 3 right away. As the borders expand, I maybe want to pick up this hill or maybe that wheat. And then as it expands much later in the game, I might want to work university tiles. But really, I don't really want this city growing more than about 5, 6 pop, maybe a little bit more, a little bit later in the game, because it doesn't have tiles to work that are worth the unhappiness of that population point. Now, there's the exception being the capital. The capital, you want it to grow because the way City Connection Gold is calculated, City Connection Gold is based on the population in the capital, the population in the expand, and then the distance from that, basically. So what you don't want to have, what that means is the more population in the capital, the more every single city connected to the capital grants gold for. So you want to grow in the capital a lot still, but the other cities, it's much more important to micromanage the growth than it would be in a Tradition game. When you're planning your Liberty cities, you really want to plant, let's say you find your border. So let's say I kept scouting with this guy and I encountered a player over here. And then let's say there was an impenetrable mountain range over here as I scouted and another player up here. I'm basically going to be like, okay, this land is my land then. And then I want to start thinking about my city placements. We already talked about how many cities can you plant. You might want to plant a little less than suggested if you're planning on going to war, because you need to basically accommodate the players you're going to conquer. If you're going to take over city-states, you may want to plant a little bit less for the same reason, because you're going to be taking over land of itself. But in general, you want to be like, how many cities can I fit in this land, and where do I want to fit them? Liberty cities, you want them as close as possible to each other. And this is because of the way that city connection gold is calculated. Basically, the closer they are, the less maintenance you have to spend on road tiles, which means the more value you're getting from the city connection. And B, you really need that city connection gold to be efficient as Liberty because you're going to have a lot of building upkeep costs and you need to counteract that building upkeep costs. A good rule of thumb for that is when to build roads, because I see players all the time as Liberty, they'll go Liberty, they'll rush pyramids, they'll get those free workers out. The free workers won't have anything to improve because their borders haven't expanded enough, so they'll go, I'll build city connections. And I'll see one population cities connected to the capital. A one population city with 3 tiles of road to get to it is going to be like -2 gold for the Empire. And you can't, as Liberty, afford in the early game to be getting negative gold from city connections as well as the negative gold from tile maintenance, or excuse me, from building maintenance, because you won't be able to afford it. And if you get negative gold, if you have 0 gold in your treasury and you go into negative gold, you start losing science. And in the early game, when you don't, it's a flat amount of science that's lost per gold, basically. In the early game, you have so little science total that the flat amount actually outweighs the amount of science you're getting. You can get to a point in games, if you have enough negative gold, where you make 0 science. And if you get to that point, you're screwed. You can't maintain an empire for any length of time with 0 science because other players won't have 0 science and will tech past you. So what this means is you want to be making city connections between your cities efficiently. So if, let's say, I had a city here and another one over here, I want to be thinking about the way the road runs so I can have the least number of tiles between them. I don't want to run a road here and then a road there with the, that would be like 6 city connect. That'd be 6 tiles or something when I could do that with like more like 4. So you want to be maximizing the gold from city connections, and you want to be thinking about getting gold in your empire. As tradition, I don't like working gold tiles early. If I settle on gold tiles, great, but in general, I want to be working growth and production tiles. As Liberty, gold is a lot more important. If you can do things like settle on calendar resources, that's really valuable. Calendar resources are a weak tile to work. They're generally 1 food, 1 production, and then gold. If you can settle on that, you get the gold without having to waste a population point working that tile. You can work a hill, which is just raw production, like 3 production instead, or you can work a growth tile, like a cattle or whatever else instead, and you're just going to get more value for your city. You want to grow your Liberty cities basically to the production that's available to them. So if it has a limited number of hills, you don't want to keep growing it past the number of hills it's going to be working, because you can use the happiness in a different portion of your empire to work that. The exception being if you have enough local happiness. So if you have pagodas and moss and you built coliseums, that's 5 local happiness. There's no reason your city can't be at least population 5. If you also, I don't know, let's say you're also Egypt, this gives a sense of why Egypt's so powerful. So you have, moss, pagodas, that's 3, coliseums, that's 5, and then you have burial tombs, that's 7. There's no reason that you can't grow all of your cities to population 7 if you can find the food to do it, because that has a 0 net loss of happiness to your empire based on population alone. All right, what else? We talked about settling on gold tiles. We talked about settling close together for the cities. We've talked about roads. Talked about the realistic limits. Okay, settle horses. Horses provide circuses. If you have a city that grows, first of all, the AI prioritizes horse tiles fairly highly. They're both a strategic resource, and they always have some, well, not always, but in the vast majority of times, they're either plains or grass and horses, in which case they have some food on them too. And they're a pretty high yield tile. They're going to start with 3, and once you've improved them, have at least 4 yield, 5 past when you have a stables. So they tend to be, your city grows to them fairly efficiently anyways. But anytime you have a stable, improved horses in your cities or an improved ivory in your city, that city is capable of building a circus. And a circus provides 2 local happiness. And we were just talking about how with Liberty cities you want to grow to at least the size of your local happiness available. With circuses, you can grow to 2 more. So if you have pagoda 2, coliseum 2, mosque 1, that's 5, burial tomb, that's 2 more, that's 7, and then a circus 9. You can have 9 population in that city with 0 unhappiness caused by it. And these cows are driving me nuts, so let's see if we can't shut them up for a little bit here. Thank God for that. All right, what else? Building and tile priorities. Growth is still important in Liberty cities. You do need to grow. Population is science, and science is relevancy in games, basically. So you still need to grow. But again, you don't want to grow too much in Liberty cities. You want to grow to basically the production you can work or the local happiness available to you. So there's a little bit less of a prioritization on growth in the cities that aren't your capital. You still want to grow your capital as much as you can afford happiness-wise because of the city connections, basically. And also you do need some centralized production to compete with things like natural world wonders, which you're competing with, and just have enough production to actually efficiently build national wonders, which is something you don't have to compete with other players for, but still something you need to be doing. There's much more of a priority on gold. You need to be keeping your science positive. You don't want to be losing science from gold, which means that you need to be getting enough gold in your empire to do that. That may involve working calendar resources. I hate working calendar resources because you get so little production growth out of them relative to growth or production tiles. But nevertheless, you may have to do that as Liberty. This empire looks fairly bad for Liberty, actually, to be honest. There's almost no gold in it. There's a little bit of gold off the incense. There's a little bit of gold off those gems over there. There's a little tiny bit of gold off these crabs in here, but that's it. There's pretty much no calendar resources in here to provide much in the way of gold. Now, granted, a lot of that would be countered by the fact that I get paper makers, which are +2 gold per city, but it's still a pretty sad it's a pretty low amount of gold for what a Liberty Empire is going to be needing to get from the land. And what that means is I'm likely going to run into science issues. All right. Some other things to think about. The monument costs 26 hammers to build. That means the Republic bonus, which is the +1 production here, in the 5%, basically means that it's going to be something like, you can do, it's not quite 26 because you get 1/20th of that back. It's like 25 or 20, a little over 24, a little under 25 turns before a Liberty City is as good as a tradition city, because you have to hard build monuments in your cities where you get free monuments in the cities as tradition because of legalism. Let's talk a little bit about the build order for Liberty cities. In general, if you don't have any war on the horizon, so you don't need to be military units, and let's forget about workers for a second because workers are valuable, but let's pretend that you have enough workers. In general, you're going to want to see something like monument, granary, market, library, maybe a shrine somewhere in there, maybe a couple units in there somewhere, and maybe a wonder in there if you can fit it. But really the core buildings are going to be monument, granary, market, library. That means you need to get to market tech at some point. Why market tech over library? Why are markets as important as libraries? Because in general you're going to have enough negative gold from building upkeep and unit upkeep that the gold from the market is going to be as valuable to your early game science as a library. Perhaps more so because you may not want to build libraries because libraries have upkeep that you don't want to be paying early. You might be better off just building markets early as you get your cities up and running. Let's talk a little bit about early Liberty strategies. There's probably kind of 3 general ones, right? Early Liberty strategies. The first is kill your neighbor. This has the ability to backfire. This is the one that I see most people using when they go Liberty. Generally, if my neighbors are going Liberty, I'm assuming they're rushing me. And they're going Liberty because either their lands are bad or they want more production or it's easier to build military units. But a lot of times people who do this go irrelevant. And they go irrelevant because they can't convert the lands they've taken from their neighbor into enough science and population to be competitive with other players. If you do go a strategy to kill your neighbor, you need to think about how you're going to convert your lands into something that is going to be meaningful to the late game. It's pretty pointless if you just kill your neighbor, then you go irrelevant. But it is still a viable Liberty strategy to set up to kill your neighbor. And you can do that maybe more efficiently as Liberty because hypothetically you have more hammers available to you than the tradition player, especially in the very early game. So that's one option. I see mass expansion as a Liberty option. So the way the population works in Civ is each subsequent population point in a city costs more food to reach, which means that it's easier to get 4 cities to pop 4 than it is to get 2 cities to pop 8. It takes less food to do that. Now there is the downside of you have additional science penalties per city and culture science penalties per city, so it's not quite, for example, in that scenario the 4 cities don't have twice as much science as the 2 cities, despite the fact they have twice as much population. So there is a downside to doing that, but in some sense you can compete in population by having more cities. If you have the happiness to afford that, you can just build more cities than the other player and still be competitive. So mass expansions is one of them. For example, Egypt is extremely good at mass expansions because of the burial tombs. You can also get a strong religion, and I recommend basically combining the mass expansion or the kill a neighbor with the strong religion if at all possible, because the strong religion is going to give you gold per turn, either from tithe, or church property, or even initiation rights, which are the 3 founder beliefs that give gold. Those will help offset the early game gold disadvantages that Liberty deals with, so getting a strong religion is good for that. And there's also local happiness from a strong religion, pagodas, tithes, temple happiness, garden happiness, shrine happiness, cathedrals. All of these policies give, these are founder beliefs, give happiness. Additionally, cathedrals to a little degree, pagodas and mosques to a decent degree give culture and faith per turn, both of which are really important for Liberty Empires. Liberty Empires are going to run into issues with culture per turn because as they're found more cities, the culture costs of your social policies go up. This means that Liberty Empires tend to generate a lot of culture because they have a lot of cities, each generating culture, but the culture that it costs per policy goes up faster than the culture that they're generating, which means that the policies tend to be really expensive for the amount of culture they have. Makes them resistant to tourism, but not very efficient in getting policies. Yeah, so the strong religion is going to do a lot to complement the gold and culture issues that a Liberty player is going to be having. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the mid games. That's the early game. The early game from a Liberty is basically you want to get a Liberty player, so you want to take advantage of your early hammers to do something along the lines of wonders, units, or infrastructure that a tradition player wouldn't be having in and of itself. You want to define your borders and backfill so that you can get your cities out, and you want to start thinking about getting those basic core buildings up and getting some workers out and getting your cities connected so that you're fighting the gold loss that you're getting from all those buildings you're building. And then you want to text something along the lines of you want to get, you do need a national college eventually. You're going to have to build a national college as Liberty. It's going to be later in a tradition player because you're going to have more cities. At some point, you may even want to stop producing cities long enough to get your national college up and then go back to producing more settlers for more cities. That's totally fine to do, but that may allow you to get your national college a little bit earlier. But one of the high priority techs for Liberty is actually going to be currency, because market is a very, very important building for your cities, because you need it, because it's basically going to be science. And you may end up building markets before libraries in a lot of cases. All right, so what about the mid game? So that's the very early game. Maybe you go to war. If you go to war, you really have to watch your gold per turn. War is devastating to gold per turn. You tend to build military roads that don't actually give you gold, but are very important for winning the war. You tend to be spamming a lot of units. Your gold per turn can get very, very low very, very quickly. And if you go that route, you need to be aware of that. You can't be doing that for a very long period of time because you go irrelevant to the game. What about the mid game? What is the mid game? I found personally that the tech path I really like for Liberty is I find that workshops are pretty valuable. You're already down around currency anyways. In a tradition game, civil service is extremely valuable, as is theology, but civil service in particular because you have generally a few cities often planted around river systems that get a huge amount of growth bonus and therefore a lot of science bonus from actually growing. And civil service is the first policy that gives you +1 food from city from tiles improved on fresh water. However, for the Liberty cities, that tends to be less important. The granary plus the minimal growth tiles there tend to be having your cities around 4 or 5 population already, and oftentimes you don't want to grow them that much more at that stage in the game anyways, because you don't have enough local happiness to compete for that, and your global happiness is fairly stressed. I find too that if I go civil service is also on the way to education. Education gives you universities, which is a very, very important tech. In tradition games, my cities tend to have the hammers to knock out education and then to knock out universities. And as I'm building universities, I'll often tech for metal casting. I find in the Liberty games, every time I've gone that route, what I've found is that my cities are not done building the universities anywhere near enough time before they need to start on the workshops. So a lot of times I just prefer to go the workshop route first. Workshops give flat production and percentage production. Yeah, I just saw something weird. But anyways, sorry, workshops give flat production and percentage production towards everything, basically. So that it can be very beneficial, at least I've found, to do something along the lines of early game, you're taking the techs that you need for your resources, maybe a military tech or two, depending on what you're trying to do, like strategic resources or something like that. And then you're going to be heading some combination of writing, currency, and philosophy to get your national college out. And then you're going to be heading down, often for me as Liberty, down into metal casting to get my workshops out. This is going to do 3 things, right? The first is it gets me around that building block. You can get production blocked when you have like 3 or 4 buildings that you really need in your cities, but you don't have the production to knock them out fast enough as you're getting those techs out, and you end up in this like queue of like 3 or 4 buildings that you really don't want to be in. So this helps me get around that production block. It also sets me up for a very, very strong mid game here. Liberty hammers are probably peaking about there. Your cities grow very, very quickly to like 4, 5, 6 pop, and then they start slowing down as they get to 7 or 8 or 10, etc. Right? So in that stage of the game, you probably have 10 cities, 8 cities, something like that, and your opponents are probably sitting on 3 to 5 cities. And at that point in the game, Your cities are probably up to 3 to 5 pop or 5 to 6 pop or something like that. You're probably working all of the hills that you have in your empire because you're prioritizing production tiles. So you're not growing as much because you don't want to grow too much. You're micromanaging your growth. At that point, you're probably at your peak hammer ratio compared to a tradition player, where you're probably almost 2 to 1 to his hammers at that point in hammers. At that point, getting workshops further accentuates that, right? It further makes that hammer bonus there. And then it also sets you up nicely if you want to do some sort of medieval push, which almost always involves crossbows, right? So there's 2 other benefits to going down this route. The first is crossbows, which are very, very close to metal casting. You're going to need currency in guilds. You probably already have currency because you're teching from markets. So then filling out metal casting and then spamming some crossbows can be very, very strong for a timing push, as well as Notre Dame, which is 10 global happiness, as well as some faith return, which is very, very strong if you can get that. So both of those are down there. But I tend to often go workshops and then education for universities, and then something like whatever it happens to be to enter the Renaissance era. In the mid game, so workshops in Notre Dame can be strong. You have to have your markets, your national college up. Expos are quite strong. I recommend pre-building units. A lot of times you'll get to a point in Liberty Cities where you don't have anything you particularly want to build. You don't really want to be building not workshops. You don't really want to be building watermills. Watermills are quite good. It's +2 food and +1 production, but it has two maintenance upkeep, which is a little unfortunate. Sometimes I build them in Liberty Cities. If I have enough tiles, I know I'm going to want to work. The population can be useful, but a lot of times I don't because I don't want to pay the upkeep. And the upkeep is a big enough deal that I don't want to build it. And I may need the upkeep for something else like temples for the faith return. Temples here. So sometimes I'll get to a point in the game where I'm expecting military action in the medieval era. I'm either going to be attacked or I'm going to be doing some attacking. I don't have a ton of buildings I need to be building anyways, or if I do have buildings that are available, they're kind of low priority buildings that I don't really want, like watermills or amphitheaters or something like that. One of the things you can do then is you can pre-build units. This is where you pick a unit. Let's say that you have composite bow tech and you want to do a crossbow push. As Liberty, you probably don't have the gold to upgrade many composite bows from crossbows because you just don't have the gold return to do that. So realistically, what you can do is instead you can build a combo and you can build it all the way up until it has 1 turn left. And then instead of finishing it, you can do it with archers too. You can do archers to crossbows or archers to composite bows. Instead of finishing it, you build other things in the meantime. Maybe you build a swordsman all the way up to one turn, or a spearman all the way up to 1 turn. And then when you hit crossbow tech, what you can do is those hammers aren't lost. You hit crossbow tech at that point. It then determines the amount of hammers that you've already spent on the composite bow. How many more hammers do you need to get to the actual crossbow? And that's how much more production you have to spend to get a crossbow. And what it lets you do is it lets you put hammers towards a crossbow before you have a crossbow tech. If you just tech to crossbows and then started building crossbows, you'd have to pay the entire cost, which is something like 80 hammers, right? But instead, if you build the combo all the way up to 1 turn, you've spent almost 50 of those. You've already paid of those 50 of those 80 hammers already. So the first crossbow that you produce out of that is only going to cost you 30 more hammers than you've already basically spent. So you can pre-build units, and that's very strong for war. It also has the benefit of not having to pay upkeep on those units before you built them, because they're not just sitting around waiting in your empire. They're not actually built, so you don't have to pay upkeep on them. And it keeps your military score lower than it actually is. So if you do get attacked, you can very quickly just finish those units if you need them right then. Or if you're going to attack someone, you can finish a set of units. You can finish that combo. You can finish that swordsman right before you go and attack someone, and your military score won't reflect that except for 1 or 2 turns before that. All right, what else should you be doing in the mid-game? Probably somewhere around the classical to medieval era, you're going to be finishing all the policies in your culture and your social policy tree in Liberty. At that point, you get the option of 1 great person. There's really only 4 great people you should ever be considering for this. They are, in rough order, scientist, engineer, prophet, general. And honestly, 2 you should only really be considering are scientists in general. And the scientist is basically going to be, you're going to plant that scientist, you're not going to bulb it, you make it into an academy tile, and that's basically going to be just a flat 8 science for your empire, which is pretty good. I mean, that's not bad, especially early game, it's quite a big chunk of it. And it's going to help you be competitive with the fact that probably at this point in the game, tradition players are already making more science than you. So this will help you be a little bit more competitive with keeping that science difference lower down. Alternatively, you can pick up a general if you're really, really pressed in war. That can be a very good thing. Sometimes an engineer can be good, and really what you have to be thinking about, if you're going to take an engineer from that, it better be set for something monstrous. And either it might need to be something like you're negative gold and suddenly you get Machu Picchu, and that means that your gold is stabilized and that actually equates to science, or something like you're so low on happiness that you need something like Notre Dame, and that also equates to growth, which equates to science. In other words, the engineer is basically a substitute for the scientist, and maybe a more efficient substitute depending on what your situation is. Sometimes you can get a profit too. I really don't recommend this. This is a kind of desperation play. Perhaps if you need to enhance a religion and maybe mosques are still available and you already have pagodas, that could be something important. Maybe it's worth getting a profit then, but even then it's a very high opportunity cost of losing that scientist or engineer to pick up that profit. But sometimes enhancing that religion can be very, very powerful at that point in the game. So that's what I recommend for those. At this stage in the game, by the time you hit medieval, you're going to start suffering from cultural policies already. You're going to have your 8 to 10 cities out. Your cities are going to be making 2 culture per turn from the monument and 1 culture per turn from being liberty, which means that your cities are going to be making 3 culture per turn, and the cost of them is going to be plus 10% per city that you founded. You're going to start suffering at this point in the game. You can go to war in the medieval era, and that's totally fine. That is a strategy that works for Liberty players a lot of the time. But the problem you're going to run into is in a 6-way free-for-all, if you go to war, you have 5 players to kill before the game ends. 5 players is a hell of a lot of people to kill. That's a hell of a lot of cities you have to capture with a hell of a lot of happiness it's going to cost you to do that. And those are wars you have to win. And players aren't stupid. If they see you going to war and they know that you're killing your neighbor and they're the next neighbor, they're going to build military. And they're probably going to be ahead of you in tech because military units cost you production, which can't be used for production or science buildings, and also they cost you gold per turn, which can't be used for things like purchasing cultural city-states or just not being negative science or this kind of stuff. So they're probably going to be a little bit ahead of you every time you attack each subsequent neighbor. And what it really works out to be is that probably even if you're a really good player on a really good civ and you're facing fairly mediocre opponents, probably by the time you kill that 3rd opponent, maybe if you're really, really good and they're really, really bad, that 4th opponent, the other player has teched past you, way past you, into a position where you no longer have military units that are capable of assailing their position or assailing their civ. And that's not even counting like terrain or distance or stuff like that. So yeah, the medieval push can be strong, and if you have a medieval unit, that can be quite strong as well. But in all likelihood, it's not going to win you the game because you're much more likely to be out-teched and made irrelevant by that point. If you do kill a bunch of your opponents, you need to be very efficient at converting their cities. And this is where I'm going to talk about Jesuit education. Because basically what happens, as you take over cities, it costs you happiness. You can't burn all the cities you take because you can't burn capitals or holy cities anyways. And a lot of times you actually don't want to burn the cities because they're decent cities and you want to keep them. And you want to flip them around and make them into something useful. The problem is that when you capture cities, you lose about 50% of the buildings in the city that you capture. And that's assuming they haven't sold any or the city wasn't taken back and forth like 2 or 3 times. And what it means is that you get a city that's basically a shell of a city. You might have some population, it takes a couple turns for the resistance to cool down, so you can actually use it, but it probably is missing a lot of critical buildings. Probably doesn't have that monument, you're already suffering from culture, you can't afford your cities to be making 1 culture instead of 3 culture, so you're going to have to build that monument. You really can't afford not to have workshops in your cities at this point in the game because everything else is going to take too long to build if you don't have workshops. And of course it probably doesn't have all the science buildings that you need because you need to be making science because you're probably behind in science at this point in the game. So you got to build your libraries and your universities. Probably it needs a granary because, you know, hell, you want the city to grow to a population that's going to be high enough production to actually build the units you need to do. So you're going to be playing catch up with all these buildings, all these cities that you capture, even if you're successful in war. Or in the same problems too if you're founding new cities, right, that you're going to need to be playing catch up. Jesuit education is amazing for this. This is where, you can use religion to supplement the issues of liberty. Jesuit education allows you to purchase universities, public schools, and research labs with faith. They're quite expensive, but they're not that expensive for Liberty Empire. Liberty Empire is they only really do 2 things better than tradition. They have a decentralized production, so their overall hammer count will be higher, although each city is likely going to be lower hammer count than each tradition city. So they're not better at building wonders, they're not better at building buildings because they have to build more buildings and they have less hammers per city. But what they are better at is overall hammers, which can be used for basically military. And they're better at overall faith production because faith is limited to basically plus X per city. And the per city part is where the Liberty gets better than tradition players at generating faith. So what can you do? How do you take advantage of these two things that Liberty does better than tradition? Well, the first is you produce military units because it doesn't really matter what city they come out of, barring upgrade buildings. It doesn't really matter what city they come out of. So having overall production means you can produce more military units than the tradition player overall. And more faith per turn means that you can do things with religion better than tradition players can once you get that religion. So you can purchase more pagodas, which in turn makes more culture, which supplements your culture problem, gives you more local happiness, which supplements your happiness problem, and gives you more faith per turn, which even further extends how many more faith buildings you can purchase. If you can get pagodas and mosques, which I really don't recommend for non-Liberty games because you tend not to have the faith return to actually get pagodas and mosques. But if you're in a Liberty Empire, you probably can actually get pagodas and mosques if you can get both of those taken, or pagodas in cathedrals, which is a lot of local unhappiness, a lot of culture, and a lot of faith return. And then as that faith return gets more and more like basically rolling, as you get shrines in your empire or unique buildings or pagodas or mosques or cathedrals or whatever it is, as you get more and more in your cities, your faith return goes up. And you run into this weird issue. In tradition, in the late game, what you're going to do is you're going to purchase engineers with that faith. And you're going to purchase engineers to get the ideology wonders, and then you're going to purchase scientists when you finish rationalism. With Liberty, you can't purchase engineers because finishing Liberty doesn't actually let you purchase great people. What you can probably do with those instead is you can do things like, if you have a good religion, you can purchase science buildings. And that gets around the fact that your cities are, especially cities you're capturing, are going to be behind. Cities that you found are going to be behind in the production. Your cities are going to be hard pressed to keep up with the production that you need to be building. So it's really nice not to have to hard build science buildings. I really recommend Jesuit education for big Liberty empires. Also, you're going to find, especially if you go military routes, that even in the mid-game, you're going to be suffering in gold. I really recommend entering Renaissance through either acoustics or banking if you're going Liberty. And there's really two options for that. First of all, Sistine Chapel is absolutely amazing for Liberty cities. Basically, it's +1 culture per city. And since you have so many cities, this is actually very, very valuable. It's probably going to be 10, 15, or maybe even 20 culture in a Liberty empire, which is fairly decent. So getting Sistine is nice, and entering through Renaissance, it tends to not be a highly competitive wonder. People don't tend to enter Renaissance through acoustics. They either enter astronomy for military text or navigation, or for observatories, or they enter printing press for Leaning Tower. So entering acoustics may allow you to actually hard build Sistine Chapel in your lower production, in one of your cities that has lower production than the equivalent of the tradition player. In other words, if you both enter at the same time, they can race you for the wonder and beat you. But because it's such a lower priority tech path, you can actually get Sistine, so that's quite valuable. Or opening through banking, because building banks in all your cities is actually very important too, because again, you're going to be suffering with Liberty maintenance costs, so getting gold buildings is always very valuable. So basically in the mid-game, what you're starting to run into is the fact that the scaling costs for culture and science of founding more cities is going up faster than the population that you get from these cities is generating science. In other words, you're going to be at a net loss of science and culture relative to tradition players because of the way the scaling works in this game. So you need to find some way in the mid-game to compete with this. And there aren't a lot of ways. One way is to wipe out all your opponents, but that's extremely challenging. One way is that you can get Jesuit education that gets around some of the production costs that are associated with that, which lets you get back into the science game to be competitive with that. And one of the other ways you can do is something like gold purchasing strategies, where you can try to get, you can build trading posts everywhere in your empire. And this is, again, getting around the production issues, right? So that you might not, yes, you're going to have to build those buildings, but you can build buildings and still get units. Whereas if you don't have gold purchasing, you might have to build the buildings and then build units, and then you're going to be behind in that production game. What else? Also in the mid game, at some point you're going to reach a place, probably after your first war. You may not even have a war. You don't have to have a war as Liberty. I have a game coming up shortly. Actually, I think it's out already. I think it's I'll link it in the guide, but I think it's the recent Celts game I played, where I have a Liberty game where I had no war as Liberty, but I kept up with tradition in science. And at some point, what you have to do is you have to assign specialists, even though you don't want to. So up until that point, you've probably been basically growing your cities until they don't have any more tiles to work that are good tiles, and then you don't really let them grow anymore. You either stagnate them or just avoid growth on them. But at some point, you're going to have to decide that you're going to sacrifice some of your decent tiles to work scientist slots. And you don't really have a choice here, because it isn't so much the science, although the science in of itself is fairly strong, especially after secularism. That's quite a lot of science that's being worked. But really what it boils down to is that you need to generate great scientists themselves, because in the late game you have to have great scientists to bulb to actually be competitive with the players racing for military techs. And if you don't start generating great scientist points at some point in the game, especially the early game, excuse me, especially the mid game, you're not going to have enough great scientists in the late game to be relevant. So at some point you will have to make the decision in some of your cities, preferably more than some of your cities, preferably all of your cities, that I'm going to work great scientists, specialist slots. And this is going to be challenging because your populations really aren't going to be large enough to support that while still working all of your good tiles. But that will be a decision you'll have to make as Liberty. All right, we talked about banks, we talked about Sistine Chapel. Maybe some other things to think about in the early game. You know, as a Liberty player, you're going to run into culture problems in the late game, and this is because of the way that science works in Civilization 5, right? So let's talk about this for a minute. the way that culture and science interact in this game is that basically in the late game, culture is science. And it's science because all your culture in the late games goes into rationalism. And it goes into rationalism because if you don't go into rationalism, other players are putting it into rationalism and they get science from culture and you don't. So you're forced to go into rationalism to compete with their science. And every one of these policies gives science in some way, right? Secularism is a flat science boost from specialists. Humanism gives great scientists faster. Free thought is a flat boost in science from trading posts and a percentage boost from universities. Sovereignty, I guess this one is not direct science. This is gold from science buildings, which is useful, but not direct science. But it does unlock scientific revolution, which isn't in of itself a science boost, except that when you finish all of rationalism, which you have to finish scientific revolution to do, you get a free social policy, a free tech, just instantly a free tech, and then you can purchase great scientists with faith. So you have to you need to start putting points in rationalism to be competitive. What this means is in the early game, you're going to fill out tradition or liberty. You're going to have basically 1 to 3 social policies in between finishing your primary tree, but before you can unlock rationalism, because rationalism isn't available until the Renaissance era. For tradition players, it doesn't really matter where those points go. For liberty players, you're pretty limited as what you can do. Yes, some points in commerce would be valuable. Something like the open air plus wagon trains would be good. That would be half off all your roads and extra gold in the capital. And that's okay. That's not bad. But really, what it boils down to is that's not going to be enough to be competitive with tradition players. You need something else. And really what Liberty does better than tradition is it does overall hammers, and it does overall hammers in the early to mid game, I should add. It doesn't do overall hammers better in the late game. Overall hammers in the early to mid game, and it does faith production. So really what I recommend as a Liberty player is piety. And I actually don't like this about Liberty. Liberty to me feels very fragile, right? In that you're forced into a number of decisions with the tech tree and the social policy trees and wonder choices that you don't really want to be forced into, not because they're bad decisions, but because it's the only way that it works, right? It's an underpowered social policy tree, basically. So you're going to have culture issues, and you're going to have culture issues for 2 reasons. The first is in the very late game, like mid to late game, rather, not the very late game, the mid to late game, you're not making culture as efficiently as tradition players. You're not getting as many social policies, basically, and you're going to be competing with them to fill out rationalism as quickly as possible because you both need it for science. So in the late game, mid to late game, you're going to need more culture than you're getting in the early game. In the early game, you're going to fill out Liberty just fine, but you're going to have those filler policies. And what you really would like to do as Liberty is you'd really like to get into Reformation beliefs. You really like to go organized religion, religious tolerance, Reformation beliefs, Jesuit education. And that's 4 social policies. And really, you only tend to have 1 to 3 afterwards. So you're really down a policy doing that already. But you need that to be competitive in science with tradition players. So what you know from right at the start of a Liberty game, that you're a Liberty game where you're not just warring all the time, or a Liberty game where you have some ability to choose what you're going to do in that game, is that you need to prioritize culture extremely highly. I tend to try to get Oracle as Liberty. And there's no reason you can't do that. You're going to have a much later National College than tradition players as Liberty players, and almost always. So what this often means is, tradition players are often prioritizing their National College. You can sometimes snag Oracle. If you do get Oracle early, you want to fill out Liberty as soon as you can to get that great scientist, get your city connection happiness going. And then I really recommend putting points in piety, because you want to get down organized religion, religious tolerance, and Reformation belief. And also, if you can, mandate of heaven, but very rarely do I have the culture to do that. Because as soon as you can put points into rationalism, you want to finish up piety and actually put points into rationalism. Parthenon's quite nice for the same reason. It's not a great wonder, but it has 6 culture per turn on it, and that's fairly decent in the early game. So if you can get Oracle and Parthenon, and then potentially Sistine Chapel, and then pagodas or moss, or both, suddenly you're doing a lot for your culture game. All right. And you need that because what you want to do eventually is you want to get your Reformation belief for Jesuit education, and then you want to be competitive with tradition players in the number of policies they're putting in rationalism. And if you can finish rationalism, great, because you're going to have so much more faith per turn than they will that you might be able to get up to 1 to 2 more great scientists from that than they can as well. All right, so we're kind of working our way through the Liberty game. We talked about the early game. We talked about early game strategies for that. Talk about early game build orders. Talk about settling cities for that. Talk about the way you need to think about that. Talk about your kind of options for what you can do as that. Then I'm talking a little bit about the mid game. We're talking a little bit about the tech tree. Tech tree gets a little bit more, once you've entered Renaissance, there's not a whole lot to say. You really have 2 kind of options, right? The first is you're going to continue your medieval push. So let's say 2 of your opponents warred on the other side of the continent. One of them won, but he's not all that strong because of that, right? He's still absorbing that empire. And that leaves 3 guys around you. And let's say one of them's not that good. Let's say he went Liberty and tried to attack his neighbors and went irrelevant. and that leaves only 2 guys you have to kill. Suddenly you're in a position where you have your 2 neighbors you need to kill and that 1 guy on the other side of the continent who's gone to war. That's suddenly doable. 3 players is fairly doable. At that point you may decide for a strong medieval push, capitalizing on your liberty opening, capitalizing on those liberty hammers, capitalizing on the early workshops, and maybe you have a unique unit like the Chukanu or something like that. You may decide on a medieval push, and that medieval push may get through that first guy, maybe that second guy, while it's still in the medieval and Renaissance. Then you're going to be hitting late Renaissance, and suddenly the medieval push isn't going to be that strong. You may though, however, if there's not a million players left and they're all not super ahead of you in tech, you may be able to clean up that last guy by going arties. And that's one of the options that you have in the industrial era, as particularly as a liberty game, where it's already been a military liberty game. You just continue along that military path and you pick up artillery, cavalry, and artillery, and you push in and kill him. That's a fairly reasonable way to end the liberty game. That's pretty much the ideal way to end the liberty game, because that's when, basically by the end of industrial, that's when all the liberty bonuses, all the liberty strengths are basically disappearing, because at that point tradition's pretty much caught up to you in hammers. Maybe not across your empire, but the hammers that you have above and beyond him are probably less than the hammers that you have to spend building the same buildings. So you have to build 8 factories where he only has to build 4, and yes, you have more than his hammers, but you don't have double his hammers anymore. So basically, that's one option to do, is the military option. If you don't go that route, something like entering industrial era through industrialization for coal is quite good. If you have a lot of land, you're more likely to have coal. Getting 3 factories up lets you choose an ideology. All 3 ideologies are very good for liberty. The problem is that you tend to be last to ideology, because most tradition players are going to enter industrial through scientific theory. They're going to quickly tech electricity, and then they're going to Oxford radio, and that's going to give them an ideology very, very quickly. You tend to be a little bit slower in science behind them, getting into an industrial era, and if you have to build factories, you're going to be quite a bit slower, and in all likelihood, you're not going to have the same science return to be as quick to the Oxford path that they are. So you're probably going to have to build factories. What this tends to mean in high-level games with good players, you tend to be last to ideology going liberty, unless you just had some phenomenal early game. And if you're last to ideology, you don't get you can't make the decision right ahead of time. You can't go, I'm liberty, I want to go order, I'm going to get order and get all the good policies from it, because you don't know what they're going to pick. And probably if you're 3rd or 4th to ideology, or 5th or 6th to ideology, there's probably already 2 people in freedom, there's probably already 2 people in order. So you're probably not getting many policies at all. However, if you have the choice, all 3 of them are quite good. Freedom gives you less food for specialists, which is really good. It gives you a food bonus for each specialist employed in a city, which is really good because you're going to be struggling to work specialists at all. And it also gives you Statue of Liberty, which you'll never get as a Liberty player, but if you did get it, that would be amazing, because it's an incredibly powerful ideology wonder. And additionally, it's going to give you some happiness in there, which is good too. Order, I really recommend factory science if you can get it, but it's pretty unlikely that will happen. Mostly if you can go through industrialization to get factories, and you can get factory science, which again, it's pretty unlikely if you get both those things happening for you. But if you do get that, it will really, really help your game if you can build factories twice as efficiently across most of your empire, not counting the first 3. But if you have 10 cities and you can build the first 3 very quickly, maybe you purchase 1 or 2 and hard build 1 in your capital, and then you have the other 7 to build, and you can build them with the bonus from order, from the tier 2 tenant order that gives you half-off factories. That's huge, because that's going to really prevent that deadlock of buildings that you tend to get in the industrial era. So if you're not going the military route, I do recommend trying to get an ideology as quickly as possible, and then trying to maximize that ideology to help you out. If you get stuck with autocracy, that's fine. The spy stealing is really the one that's going to be most beneficial for you there. If you time your tech path right and put spies in the right cities, not always their capital, but other high science cities that don't have counter spies, you may be able to steal some of the critical text over here. If you've gone Jesuit education at that point, going industrialization into scientific theory tends to be pretty efficient. It's a little bit quicker to get into industrialization straight up, and if you go in, I think it's two techs cheaper to get into industrialization instead of scientific theory. As soon as you get into the industrial era, if you have Jesuit education, or it doesn't even matter if you're Jesuit education, as soon as you get into the industrial era, your profits stop auto-spawning. And that means that you can pool faith. And you want to pool faith if you're going a Jesuit education strategy, because you need that pooled faith to purchase public schools very quickly once you hit that tech. So going industrialization also stops the great profits from spawning, which is really nice, because you don't want to, what you don't want to have happen is the turn before you get to scientific theory, your great profit spawns, it wipes out 1,500 faith or something that you've saved up, and you suddenly have 0 faith for Jesuit education. So that can be good too, and it may get you a faster ideology from that. But in all likelihood, you're not getting 2 free social policies and an ideology, and you're already social policy starved. So it tends to be very difficult to get the tier 2 tenets quickly as Liberty. All right, moving on. So hopefully you are at this stage in the game filling out rationalism. You have your Reformation belief as piety. You have a strong religion. You're competing culturally and you're competing scientifically. You're maybe a little bit behind, but not too far behind. You're getting a little bit production blocked on the fact that you're required to build repeated expensive buildings like windmills and factories and hydro plants. But you're coming into the late game. You didn't go the Arties. Maybe you went Arties and you won your game. Great. But if you don't go Arties, this is the route you're going to have to be. What are you going to do for the late game as Liberty? Well, again, you need to beeline plastics. You need to beeline plastics because you really need to get Jesuit education, to get that last portion, to get the research labs up as soon as possible. And then you need to start spamming units that are going to survive multiple upgrades. You can even start that earlier. You may have a lull in production, especially if you have Jesuit education. You can insta purchase your public schools. You may have a lull in production after factories, but before research labs. As you tech through the lower techs here through gunpowder, metallurgy, rifling, steam power, replaceable parts, etc. And basically the lull is before you can start spamming bombers. Bombers are a unit that always give back value. Once you can start building bombers, it's always worthwhile to build them because they're going to be upgraded from bomber, from Great War bomber to regular bomber to stealth bomber. And stealth bombers don't go obsolete. They're the late game premier unit. So having those pre-built, so starting building either Great War bombers and then upgrading them, or even just leaving them at 1 turn pre-built, that's going to be valuable. But there's a chunk of time in between factories and research labs where you may have time left over in your cities where you're not building anything. And you could build stock exchanges. That's quite valuable. They're good, but they're fairly expensive. But you could also build things like you could start building muskets, not let them finish, and then as you get to the tech for rifles, build the rifle up to 1 turn, not let it finish. Then as you get the tech for Great War Infantry, build the Great War Infantry up to 1 turn, then not let it finish. And then as you get plastics tech, start building those infantry and let those infantry come out. Infantry are fairly good. They're basically a blocker unit. They're going to prevent people from conquering you and delay people from using like planes to kill your cities for a while. They're not great and they need to be upgraded. Raw units are not that strong. You may need to fit in some armories, barracks, and military academies to get cover promotions or that kind of thing. But the late game, basically what you're trying to do is get to a position where you can build bombers or build AA guns, because this is the blocker unit that replaces the infantry and becomes a mobile SAM a little bit later, which are actually units that can stand up to bombers and later on delay stealth bombers a little bit. And then all you want to do is spam bombers, AA guns, and later paratroopers, because that is going to be your late game. Your late game is going to be a military strategy. It's almost assured if you go Liberty, you're going to be not the first person to any of these techs, the later game techs. You're going to be slower in your great scientist production, and you're going to be a little bit behind on that. When you get there, there's a couple things you can do. You can wait for other people to bulb their scientists first. That allows you to get more efficient use of your scientists because there's a reduction in costs for all scientists of techs that people have already researched. So if they bulb for research, if 2 people bulb for bomb shelters before you, that means there's going to be that much less cost in all these, so your scientists become more efficient. You can try to get scholars and residence passed. This is fairly good for Liberty players to get scholars and residence passed. Although I have found there's been a couple games where my science has been so good as Liberty doing the strategy that I'm describing to you with the high culture and focus on Jesuit education that I didn't want scholars and residence passed because I was actually teching ahead of people. But in the late game, you're going to run into the issue that in the late game, highly promoted units are really good. Highly promoted bombers that have air repair, highly promoted infantry with double cover, highly promoted mobile SAMs with double cover, highly promoted paratroopers with double cover. All these things are going to be very, very strong, as well as being able to very quickly crank out missiles, nuclear missiles or atomic bombs, either from very high production cities or from purchasing them. And you're probably not going to be competitive with that. Additionally, you're going to have to build bomb shelters in 10 cities and they're only going to have to build bomb shelters in 4 cities. So you're at a disadvantage in the late game. And the only way I've found to be particularly useful in in that is to have a lot of pre-built units during slow times in my production queue otherwise. Because if I don't, it will take me, if it takes me 8 turns to build an infantry in one of my cities and they're attacking me and I haven't pre-built that at all, that's 8 turns before I can get the freaking thing out. So I haven't found that to be an efficient strategy. I tend to need to pre-build a little bit. And again, the Liberty late game is worse than the traditional late game. It's not as good as science in the late game, and it's not as good as in centralized production, and those become more and more important as the game continues. I mean, Liberty is an early game strategy that you can make work in the late game if you really, really twist the tech tree as much as you twist the tech tree, take advantage of faith as much as you can, but you're still probably coming in at a disadvantage of that. Alright, so bombers, blocker units like SAMs and infantry, maybe some promotion buildings and maybe some gold buildings. Again, if you do get stuck going autocracy, that's not always the worst thing ever, because one of the things you can do late game to make up for the fact that it takes your cities 20 turns to build a friggin' mobile SAM is that you can go a gold purchasing strategy. You can convert all of your hills and all of your lands into trading posts and take autocracy purchasing, which is mobilization. It's 33% off purchasing, and then maybe if you can sneak in Big Ben somewhere, get Big Ben as well, and then you can purchase units. It won't be terribly efficient. You're very unlikely to have the points to get mercantilism and commerce, which is the other purchasing policy down here, but it may help counteract the fact that your cities are so slow at producing units relative to the tradition players. But if you get to the late game in Liberty and you're still competitive in science, you're probably no longer hammer leader, or if you are hammer leader, it's probably not by very much, which means it's just because the tradition players, the multipliers have caught up. But if you get to there tech-wise, you're still in the game. And you had the payoff. I mean, the payoff for the tradition player was he suffered through the early and mid game where you were dominant, and the late game is his game. For you, if you make it to the end game, the very late game is Liberty, and you haven't killed all the players in the map because you didn't go that route, and you're still competitive in science, you still have a chance. And you may be behind, and it may be a lesser chance, but it's still a chance to win the game, then you can win those games. So I think the TLDR, the too long didn't read this, didn't watch this for this, is that Liberty is an early to mid game dominant strategy. It has a lot of holes in it, but the holes can often be plugged by understanding the challenges you're going to face, by working out ahead of time your tech tree choices, working out how you're going to counter the gold loss, thinking about the civ you're playing, thinking about the religion, prioritizing a strong religion, understanding what religious choices are going to complement the Liberty strategy, and then taking advantage of those hammers in the early and mid game. Since you have those hammers, you need to be thinking, the late game is not my game. How am I going to make them, the early and mid game, my game instead? But if you get into scenarios where you're playing with strong players who don't roll over and die when you attack them, and you can't take out the world and kill them beforehand, and even the potential like thought of artillery, you look at the tech tree and you go, if I go artillery now, there's no way that I'm going to get to them before they get infantry to stop my artillery. You still have chances, Liberty, in the late game. You just need to really be planning ahead to do that. Anyways, guys, I know this is kind of theory heavy, not so much action on the screen, but talking a lot about the ideas behind Liberty. It's been very interesting for me experimenting with this. You probably see on my YouTube the last couple months, last month maybe, I've been spending a lot of time playing Liberty games, and just with various degrees of success, trying artillery, trying Jesuit education, trying tech pass, trying war, trying no war, etc. as I've been kind of stumbling through this. But hopefully the information that I managed to collect here is useful to you guys in applying to your game. And I really hope for the rest of you guys who I play with in the No Quitters games that I see less of you going irrelevant as Liberty and more of you making it to the late game, even if it's in a weaker position, but still being there as opposed to being irrelevant in the Renaissance, industrial, or modern era. So anyways, guys, thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed this stuff, hit the follow button, and check me out on my Twitch or my YouTube, and leave a comment. So anyways, guys, FilthyRobot out.